She snatched the plate right out of my hands and said, "You've had enough, Grandma." I smiled and said nothing, but what I discovered next, and what I did about it, left the entire family in shock. "I'm grateful you're here. Stay with me until the end and comment which city you're watching from so I can see how far my story reaches." I never imagined that at 70 years old, after surviving a World War's aftermath, raising 3 children on my own, and building a life from nothing, I would find myself being treated like an inconvenient piece of furniture in my own son's home. But there I was that bright Sunday morning in March, standing in Nathaniel's expansive kitchen in the Oakmont Hills subdivision of Maplewood Springs, watching my daughter-in-law, Vivienne, orchestrate what she called the most important brunch of the season, with the intensity of a military general preparing for battle. The kitchen itself was a monument to excess: granite countertops that stretched for miles, stainless steel appliances that cost more than I'd earned in entire years of my working life, and a wine refrigerator that held bottles worth hundreds of dollars each. Everything gleamed with the kind of perfection that came from having professional cleaners visit twice a week. It was beautiful, certainly, but it had never felt warm. Not like the small kitchen where I'd raised Nathaniel, where the counters were scratched from years of use and love. "Beatrice," Vivienne called out sharply from the adjacent dining room, her voice cutting through my thoughts like a knife through butter. She never called me Mom, never even called me Mother Beatrice. Just Beatrice, as if I were her contemporary rather than the woman who had given birth to her husband. "Make sure those linen napkins are folded in the fan pattern I showed you. And for heaven's sake, check those champagne flutes again. I absolutely cannot have any water spots when the Worthingtons arrive." The Worthingtons. Gerald and Priscilla Worthington, to be precise. Vivienne's new friends from the exclusive Maplewood Springs Country Club, where membership required not just money but the right connections, the right last name, the right everything. This brunch had consumed Vivienne's every waking moment for the past 2 weeks. I'd heard about nothing else. The menu had been planned and replanned, the floral arrangements had been ordered from 3 different florists before she'd settled on one, and she tried on no fewer than 7 outfits before deciding on the cream-colored silk ensemble that probably cost more than my monthly pension check. My son Nathaniel had pulled me aside 3 days ago, his face creased with worry lines that seemed to have appeared overnight. "Mom," he'd said in that placating tone that always preceded a request I wouldn't like, "Vivienne is under a tremendous amount of pressure with this brunch. The Worthingtons are very influential people, and this could really help my position at the firm. Could you just go along with whatever she needs? Try not to cause any friction. Try not to cause any friction." As if I were the problem. As if I hadn't spent the last decade bending over backward to accommodate Vivienne's demands, to stay out of her way, to make myself small and unobtrusive in my son's life. But I'd nodded and smiled, as I always did, because Nathaniel was my son, and I wanted him to be happy. Even if his happiness seemed to require my diminishment. I ran my arthritic fingers carefully along each crystal champagne flute, checking for the water spots that Vivienne was convinced would ruin her entire social standing. My joints ached, they always did these days, especially in the morning, but I ignored the discomfort. I'd already washed these glasses twice, but Vivienne's anxiety meant nothing was ever quite good enough on the first, second, or even third attempt. The morning had started at 5:30 for me. Vivienne had texted me the night before with a list of small tasks she needed help with, which had turned out to be nearly everything involved in preparing a brunch for 6 people. I'd been up before dawn, driving the 20 minutes from my modest apartment in the older part of town to this showcase home in Oakmont Hills, arriving just as the sun began to paint the sky pink and gold. I'd spent the first 2 hours preparing the food. Vivienne had very specific requirements: eggs Benedict with homemade hollandaise sauce, Belgian waffles made from scratch with fresh berries and real maple syrup, not the artificial kind, smoked salmon with all the traditional accompaniments, fresh fruit parfaits with Greek yogurt and homemade granola, and Vivienne's signature avocado toast which required perfectly ripe avocados mashed with just the right amount of lemon juice, sea salt, and red pepper flakes. My back had begun aching around hour 2, a dull throb that started in my lower spine and radiated upward. My feet, swollen from standing on the hard tile floor, felt like they were being squeezed in a vice. But I kept working, kept cooking, kept making everything perfect because that's what was expected of me. "Grandma, you're blocking the refrigerator." The voice came from behind me, sharp and dismissive. I turned to find my 16-year-old granddaughter, Sloane, standing there with her hand on her hip, looking at me like I was an obstacle rather than a person. She was wearing a designer dress in a soft lavender color that complemented her highlighted blonde hair perfectly. The dress alone probably cost $600. Her makeup was flawless, applied with the skill of someone who watched countless YouTube tutorials and had an unlimited budget for products. Her phone, the latest model that had been released just weeks ago, was clutched in her perfectly manicured hand. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart," I said softly, immediately stepping aside. "I was just checking the champagne glasses. I'll get out of your way." Sloane didn't respond. She didn't even look at me as she pulled open the refrigerator door and retrieved a bottle of some expensive imported sparkling water that cost $8 for a small bottle. She twisted off the cap, took a long drink, then left the bottle on the counter rather than putting it back in the refrigerator. She walked away without a word, her fingers already flying across her phone screen as she texted someone. I stood there for a moment, staring at the abandoned water bottle, feeling something twist in my chest. This was my granddaughter. The baby I'd held in my arms in the hospital 16 years ago, marveling at her tiny fingers and her button nose. The toddler I'd babysat every Tuesday and Thursday while Vivienne went to her Pilates classes and spa appointments. The little girl who used to run to me with her arms outstretched, calling Gamma. Gamma, in that precious voice. When had she started looking at me like I was invisible? When had I become just another servant in this house? I picked up the water bottle and put it back in the refrigerator, then returned to my station at the sink, where I began the final preparations for the hollandaise sauce. The clarified butter needed to be the exact right temperature, and the timing was crucial. I focused on the work, trying to ignore the growing ache in my lower back and the heaviness settling in my chest. The doorbell rang at precisely 11 o'clock. The Worthingtons, like all people of their social standing, believed that punctuality was next to godliness. Being early was presumptuous, being late was rude, and being exactly on time demonstrated proper breeding and respect. "Beatrice." Vivienne's voice rang out with barely concealed panic. "Answer the door. And remember, you're just here to help out today. Let me do the talking. Don't monopolize the conversation or share any of your stories." My stories. She meant the stories of my life, the experiences that had shaped me, the history that I carried. Vivienne had made it clear on multiple occasions that tales of struggling through difficult times, of working multiple jobs to support my family, of the sacrifices I'd made, were not appropriate conversation for her carefully curated social events. They made people uncomfortable, she said. They were too heavy for polite company. I dried my hands on a kitchen towel and hurried to the front door, smoothing down my simple navy dress as I went. It was one of my nicer outfits, purchased from a department store sale rack 3 years ago, but it felt shabby and inadequate compared to the designer clothes that Vivienne and Sloane wore so casually. I opened the heavy oak door to find Gerald and Priscilla Worthington standing on the front step, looking like they'd stepped out of a Ralph Lauren advertisement. Gerald wore a blazer in a soft blue that probably cost more than my monthly rent, paired with perfectly pressed khaki pants and Italian leather loafers. Priscilla was draped in a flowing dress that seemed to be made of silk and whispers, accessorized with a pearl necklace that looked like it had been passed down through generations of wealthy ancestors. "Good morning," I said with a warm smile, stepping aside to let them enter. "Welcome to the Holloway home. Please come in." Priscilla swept past me without acknowledgement, as if I were a ghost. She immediately unwrapped the designer scarf from her shoulders. "Hermes," I noted, recognizing the distinctive pattern from the magazines in doctors' waiting rooms, and held it out. Not to me specifically, just held it out into the space where I happened to be standing, her eyes already scanning the interior of the house with the critical assessment of someone judging every detail. I took the scarf. The silk felt impossibly smooth and delicate in my hands, and I found myself terrified I might somehow damage it just by touching it. The weight of it seemed to carry the weight of everything it represented: money, status, a world I had never been part of and never would be. Gerald handed me his blazer without looking at me, his attention already focused on Nathaniel, who had emerged from his study with his professional smile firmly in place. Gerald. Priscilla. Nathaniel's voice boomed with manufactured enthusiasm. I'm so delighted you could join us. Please, come in. Can I get you both something to drink? We have champagne, mimosas, or if you'd prefer something non-alcoholic, we have fresh squeezed orange juice and that imported sparkling water you mentioned enjoying, Priscilla. I stood there, still holding Priscilla's scarf and Gerald's blazer, waiting for someone to indicate where I should put these precious items. When no one paid me any attention, I quietly made my way to the coat closet in the hallway. The closet was already full of expensive coats, jackets, and wraps that belonged to Vivienne and Sloane. My own modest winter coat, which I'd hung there on a visit months ago and never retrieved, had been pushed to the very back, crammed into a corner where it would be out of sight. I carefully hung Priscilla's scarf and Gerald's blazer on wooden hangers, making sure everything was perfectly smooth and wrinkle-free, then gently closed the closet door. When I returned to the main living area, Vivienne was in full hostess mode, her personality transformed into something bright and effusive that I rarely saw at home. She was showing Priscilla the new artwork she'd purchased from a gallery downtown, an abstract piece that consisted mainly of random splatters of paint that somehow cost thousands of dollars because the artist was emerging and important. Vivienne! Priscilla exclaimed, clasping her hands together in exaggerated delight. This is absolutely divine. You have such extraordinary taste. Gerald and I were just saying the other day that your home has such character, such sophistication. Vivienne beamed, soaking up the praise like a plant that had been dying of thirst. You're too kind. I've been working with this wonderful interior designer from the city. She's been featured in Architectural Digest 3 times. I drifted back toward the kitchen, feeling like a shadow, wanting to be useful and stay out of the way simultaneously. Through the doorway, I could see Sloane had positioned herself strategically in the living room, perched on the arm of the sofa in a way that showed off her expensive dress to maximum effect. She was smiling at the Worthingtons with practiced charm, playing the role of the perfect granddaughter who belonged in this world of wealth and refinement. 20 minutes later, Vivienne announced that brunch was ready. Everyone began moving toward the dining room, and I started to follow, assuming I would take my usual seat at the table. But as I approached, Vivienne caught my eye and gave me a look, one of those looks that conveyed an entire conversation in a single glance. Actually, Beatrice, she said, her voice sugary sweet but with an edge underneath like honey poured over razor blades, I think it might be more comfortable if you sat in the breakfast nook today. We need the main table for our guests, and you know how you sometimes feel overwhelmed by too much conversation. The nook will be quieter for you. The breakfast nook. A small, round table tucked into an alcove in the kitchen, separated from the main dining area by a decorative privacy screen made of intricately carved wood. It was where Vivienne and Nathaniel ate their quick weekday breakfasts. It was where Sloane did her homework when she couldn't be bothered to go upstairs to her room. It was not where family members sat during important social events. It was where you seated the help. My face burned with shame, but I forced myself to smile and nod. Of course, I said quietly. That makes perfect sense. You need the space. I caught Nathaniel's eye as I turned toward the kitchen, hoping for some sign of protest, some indication that he found this arrangement inappropriate. But he just looked away, busying himself with pulling out a chair for Priscilla Worthington. My son had just allowed his wife to banish his mother to eat alone in the kitchen while they entertained guests. And he'd said nothing. I retreated to the breakfast nook, my throat tight with unshed tears. From my position behind the decorative screen, I could see through the carved openings into the dining room, but I was clearly separated from the group. I could hear their conversation, their laughter, but I was not part of it. I was an observer of my own son's life, watching from the margins. I had filled a plate with small portions of the food I'd spent hours preparing. The eggs Benedict, which had required such careful attention to get the hollandaise sauce exactly right. A single Belgian waffle with fresh berries. A small serving of the smoked salmon. I'd been standing since before dawn, and my body was exhausted, my blood sugar dropping. I needed to eat. But as I sat there in that breakfast nook, the food tasted like ashes in my mouth. I could hear them in the dining room, and every word felt like a small knife being twisted in my chest. This hollandaise is absolutely perfect, Priscilla was saying. Vivienne, you must give me the recipe. Oh, it's just something I threw together, Vivienne replied with false modesty. I've always enjoyed cooking. It's therapeutic, really. She was taking credit for my work. For the food I'd spent hours preparing. For the hollandaise sauce I'd stood over, whisking constantly until my arm ached, making sure the temperature was exact so it wouldn't break. I set down my fork, my appetite completely gone. And Sloane, Gerald Worthington's voice boomed with approval, your mother tells me you've been accepted to the pre-law program at Whitmore Academy. That's very impressive for someone your age. Thank you, Mr. Worthington, Sloane replied, her voice perfectly modulated to sound both humble and confident. I've been working very hard. I'm particularly interested in corporate law, like my father. They went on like this for several minutes, with Sloane describing her academic achievements, her volunteer work, which consisted mainly of taking selfies at charity events, and her plans for the future. She sounded poised, intelligent, mature beyond her years. She sounded nothing like the girl who had just dismissed me like I was a nuisance to be avoided. I picked at my food, managing to eat perhaps half of what was on my plate. My stomach was in knots, and the food that had smelled so appetizing while I was cooking it now seemed impossible to swallow. I was wondering if I could slip out quietly, maybe claim I wasn't feeling well and needed to go home, when I decided to at least try to have a bit more. I stood up from the breakfast nook table, my plate in hand, thinking I would add just a small serving of fresh fruit. Maybe that would be easier to eat. Maybe something sweet and light would settle the nausea that was building in my stomach. I had barely taken 2 steps toward the kitchen counter where the fruit parfaits were arranged when Sloane appeared in the doorway, blocking my path. Where do you think you're going? She asked, her eyes narrowing as she looked at my plate, then at me. I was just going to get a little fruit, sweetheart, I said softly, confused by her aggressive tone. I thought, you've had enough, Grandma. The words came out loud and clear, cutting through the gentle background music Vivienne had put on, cutting through the polite conversation in the dining room. Loud enough that everyone could hear. Before I could process what was happening, Sloane reached out and snatched the plate right out of my hands. The movement was so quick, so unexpected, that I stood there with my hands still in the air where the plate had been, frozen in shock. You know what the doctor said about watching your portions, Sloane continued, her voice dripping with false concern that was clearly performed for an audience. You need to watch your weight at your age. It's not healthy for someone as old as you to overeat. Someone has to look out for you since you clearly can't make good decisions yourself. I stood there, completely stunned. My granddaughter, my own flesh and blood, had just publicly humiliated me, treating me like a child who couldn't be trusted to feed herself. Through the carved openings in the decorative screen, I could see into the dining room. The conversation had stopped entirely. The Worthingtons were watching with raised eyebrows and uncomfortable expressions. Nathaniel had frozen with his coffee cup halfway to his lips. Vivienne's mouth had formed a perfect O of surprise. Sloane, I started to say, my voice barely above a whisper. I'm just looking out for your health, Sloane interrupted, louder now, making sure everyone in the dining room could hear every word. Someone needs to make sure you don't hurt yourself by eating too much. Grandma, you're already overweight. Your doctor must have told you to cut back. My throat closed up. My vision blurred with tears that I absolutely refused to let fall, not here, not in front of these people. My face felt like it was on fire. I could feel the weight of everyone's stares, even though I couldn't bring myself to look at any of them. But what happened next was even worse than Sloane's public humiliation. You know what? Vivienne's voice drifted in from the dining room, carrying clearly through the screen. Sloane has a point, Beatrice. You have been looking a bit heavy lately. It's probably better if you just have some tea or water instead of eating more. At your age, you really need to be more careful about these things. The words hit me like a physical blow. Not just the judgment of my body, not just the public commentary on my weight, but the fact that Vivienne was backing up Sloane's cruel behavior. She was endorsing it. She was making it acceptable. I heard Gerald Worthington clear his throat uncomfortably. I heard Priscilla whisper something that I couldn't quite make out. But what I didn't hear was the one voice I desperately needed to hear. I didn't hear Nathaniel defending me. I forced myself to look through the screen into the dining room, hoping against hope that my son would stand up for me, would tell his daughter that her behavior was unacceptable, would remind his wife that I was his mother and deserved respect. But Nathaniel just sat there, looking down at his plate, his jaw tight, saying absolutely nothing. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He wouldn't challenge his wife or correct his daughter. He just sat there in silence while they humiliated his mother. Sloane set my confiscated plate on the kitchen counter, still half full of the food I had prepared with my own hands, and sauntered back to the dining table with a satisfied smirk on her face. She settled back into her chair and picked up her mimosa like nothing had happened, like she hadn't just publicly degraded her grandmother. I stood there in that kitchen, my hands still raised slightly in the position they'd been in when my plate was snatched away, my stomach growling with hunger I was no longer allowed to satisfy, my dignity stripped away in front of strangers, and felt something fundamental shift inside me. This was what I had become in my son's home. Not a beloved mother and grandmother. Not a respected elder who had sacrificed and struggled to give her children better lives. Not even a person deserving of basic human dignity. I was just an inconvenience. A burden. Someone to be managed, controlled, and publicly corrected when I stepped out of the boundaries they had drawn for me. Slowly, I lowered my hands. I turned away from the dining room, away from the people who were supposed to be my family, and walked back to the breakfast nook on legs that felt like they might give way at any moment. I sat down at that small table with a cup of water that I didn't want, staring at the empty placemat where my plate had been. The conversation in the dining room gradually resumed, growing more animated as the mimosas flowed and people became more comfortable. They had moved past my humiliation, dismissed it, forgotten it already. It was just a minor interruption in their perfect brunch. But I hadn't forgotten. I couldn't forget. And as I sat there, trying to make myself as small and unobtrusive as possible, I heard something that made every muscle in my body go tense. Vivienne's voice, lowered but still audible through the screen, speaking to Priscilla. Beatrice has been such a tremendous help with the household finances lately. She's on all of Nathaniel's accounts now, checking, savings, investments. She helps us manage bills and track expenses. It's wonderful having someone we can trust with those tedious details. She's actually quite good with numbers, despite her age. My blood ran cold. I was on Nathaniel's accounts. I helped manage their finances. That was a complete lie. I had never been asked to help with any financial management. I had never seen Nathaniel's bank statements. I had never been given access to any of his accounts. I didn't even know what bank he used for his primary checking account. Why would Vivienne lie about something like that? And why to the Worthingtons specifically? How wonderful, Priscilla responded, and I could hear the knowing tone in her voice. My sister did something similar with her mother-in-law several years ago. She said it made everything so much easier when the older generation is cooperative. It simplifies so many complicated matters. The way she said cooperative sent ice through my veins. There was something underneath that word, some shared understanding between these two women that I wasn't privy to. Exactly, Vivienne agreed. And Beatrice is very cooperative. She understands how important it is to be helpful, to support the family in whatever way she can. I sat very still in that breakfast nook, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Something was very, very wrong here. Vivienne wasn't just lying to impress these people. There was something calculated in the way she was speaking, something deliberate. With trembling hands, I quietly pulled my phone out of my purse. I needed to think. I needed to understand what was happening. But most of all, I needed to find out if there was any truth to what Vivienne had just said. Because if she was lying about my involvement in their finances, what else might she be lying about? The brunch continued without me. I could hear them laughing about something, the crystal clinking against china, the sound of expensive wine being poured into expensive glasses. They were having a wonderful time in there, bonding over food I had prepared, enjoying a social event I had made possible. And I sat alone in the breakfast nook, hungry and humiliated, with the terrible suspicion growing in my mind that something far worse than simple disrespect was happening in my son's household. As I sat there, I made a decision. I wasn't going to cry. I wasn't going to accept this treatment passively. And I most certainly wasn't going to ignore the lie Vivienne had just told about my access to Nathaniel's financial accounts. I was going to find out exactly what was happening in this house. I was going to discover why Vivienne would make up such a specific, detailed lie about my involvement in their finances. And when I uncovered the truth, whatever it might be, I was going to make sure that everyone understood exactly what had been done to me. The surprise I had in store for them, the shock that would leave the entire family reeling, was just beginning to take shape in my mind. The drive home from Nathaniel's house that Sunday afternoon felt longer than the actual 23 minutes it took. My hands gripped the steering wheel of my 15-year-old Honda Civic so tightly that my knuckles had gone white, and my mind kept replaying the events of the brunch like a horror movie stuck on repeat. The plate being snatched from my hands. Sloane's cruel words. Vivienne's public agreement with my humiliation. And most devastating of all, Nathaniel's silence. But beneath the hurt and humiliation, something else was churning in my mind. That conversation I'd overheard. Vivienne telling the Worthingtons that I was managing Nathaniel's financial accounts, that I had access to his checking, savings, and investments. It was such a specific, detailed lie. Why would she fabricate something like that? What purpose could it possibly serve? I pulled into the parking lot of my apartment complex, Riverside Gardens, though there was neither a river nor much in the way of gardens, just an aging 3-story building with faded yellow paint and a parking lot full of potholes. It was worlds away from the pristine elegance of Oakmont Hills, but it was mine. I'd lived here for 12 years, ever since selling the family home after my husband passed away. My apartment was on the second floor, a modest one-bedroom with worn carpet and outdated appliances, but I kept it immaculately clean. The walls were covered with family photographs spanning decades, Nathaniel as a baby, as a young boy, graduating from college, getting married to Vivienne. Sloane at various ages, from newborn to the polished teenager she was now. Evidence of a family I thought I belonged to. I made myself a cup of tea, not because I wanted it, but because it was something to do with my shaking hands. I sat at my small kitchen table and pulled out my phone, staring at it like it might provide answers to questions I was only beginning to formulate. Finally, I opened my email app and scrolled through recent messages. Bills, advertisements, newsletters from various senior centers and community organizations. Nothing from Nathaniel. Nothing that would explain Vivienne's statement about my involvement in their finances. Then I remembered something. About 2 years ago, when Nathaniel had been dealing with some complicated estate planning issues, he'd temporarily added me to one of his accounts so I could help coordinate some payments while he was traveling for business. It had been a very specific, limited situation, and the access had been removed once the issue was resolved. Or at least, I'd assumed it had been removed. My heart started beating faster. What if it hadn't been removed? What if I still had access to that account, and neither Nathaniel nor I had realized it? I opened my banking app. I used Maplewood Community Bank, the same bank where Nathaniel had his accounts. I logged in and navigated to the section where linked accounts would appear. For a moment, the screen just showed my own checking and savings accounts, the balances painfully modest compared to what I knew my son's family had. Then I saw it. A linked account labeled Nathaniel Holloway, checking account number 4782. My breath caught in my throat. I clicked on it, half expecting to receive an error message saying I didn't have access. Instead, the account opened, showing me real-time transaction information. The current balance made my eyes widen, $127,458. That seemed high for a checking account, but Nathaniel made excellent money as a corporate attorney at Whitfield and Associates. Maybe this was normal for someone at his income level. I started scrolling through the recent transactions, not entirely sure what I was looking for. At first, everything seemed ordinary. Mortgage payments, utility bills, grocery store purchases, gas station charges. The normal expenses of an affluent family living in an expensive neighborhood. But then I noticed something odd. There were regular transfers, every 2 weeks like clockwork, from this checking account to another account listed simply as V. Holloway personal account. The amounts varied but were substantial: $3,500 here, $4,200 there, $5,800 the week before. I scrolled back through the transaction history, and the pattern continued for months. Regular, large transfers to what appeared to be Vivienne's personal account. That by itself might not be concerning. Married couples managed money in different ways. Maybe they had an arrangement where Vivienne handled certain household expenses from her own account. But what made my stomach clench was what I saw when I looked more carefully at the dates and amounts. The transfers to Vivienne's account didn't correspond to any obvious bills or expenses. And more troubling, they often occurred right after large deposits hit the account, deposits that looked like they might be Nathaniel's salary or bonuses from his law firm. I grabbed a notepad and pen from the drawer and started writing down dates and amounts, trying to find a pattern. The more I documented, the more disturbed I became. Over the past 6 months alone, more than $87,000 had been transferred from Nathaniel's checking account to Vivienne's personal account. My hands were trembling as I continued scrolling. Then I found something that made my blood run cold. 3 weeks ago, there had been a transfer of $15,000 to an account labeled Sloan Holloway, trust account. The memo line read, educational expenses. $15,000 for educational expenses? I knew for a fact that Sloan attended public school, albeit the best public school in the most expensive district. But public school nonetheless. It was tuition-free. What educational expenses could possibly justify a $15,000 transfer? I kept digging, scrolling back further into the transaction history. More transfers to Sloan's trust account. $12,000 2 months ago. $18,000 4 months before that. In total, over $60,000 had been moved into Sloan's trust account in less than a year, all labeled as educational expenses. But there was something else that caught my attention. Mixed in with these large transfers were dozens of smaller cash withdrawals and debit card purchases. I started noting them down: $800 at a luxury spa, $1,200 at a high-end boutique, $3,400 at a jewelry store, $2,100 at an exclusive restaurant. The list went on and on. I sat back in my chair, my mind racing. This didn't look like normal family finances. This looked like... I wasn't sure what it looked like, but something felt very wrong. Then I remembered Vivienne's words at the brunch: she's on all of Nathaniel's accounts now, checking, savings, investments. All of his accounts. Not just this checking account. With shaking fingers, I went back to the linked accounts section of my banking app and looked more carefully. Sure enough, there were 3 other accounts listed under Nathaniel's name: a savings account, a money market account, and what appeared to be an investment account managed through the bank's wealth management division. I clicked on the savings account first. Balance, $43,218. Not as much as I would have expected for someone of Nathaniel's income, but still a comfortable cushion. I looked at the transaction history and saw the same pattern: regular withdrawals, often in large amounts, many of them transfers to Vivienne's personal account. The money market account showed a balance of only $8,947. That seemed unusually low for someone who should be building wealth and saving for retirement. Nathaniel was 45 years old. He should have been aggressively saving at this point in his life. The investment account was what truly alarmed me. It showed a current value of just $34,556. I didn't know much about investment strategies, but I knew that number was far too low for a man in his mid-40s who made the kind of salary Nathaniel earned. He should have had hundreds of thousands of dollars saved for retirement by now. I spent the next hour methodically going through transaction histories, taking notes, trying to understand what I was seeing. The picture that emerged was deeply troubling. Money flowed into Nathaniel's accounts regularly: his substantial salary, bonuses from the law firm, occasional other deposits. But the money didn't stay there. It flowed out just as quickly, primarily to Vivienne's personal account and to Sloan's trust account. The amounts being siphoned off were staggering. In the past year alone, I calculated that more than $180,000 had been transferred to these two accounts. But where was the money going after that? What was Vivienne doing with these enormous sums? And did Nathaniel know about it? I thought back to the brunch, to how stressed Nathaniel had seemed, to the worry lines on his face that I'd noticed when he asked me to not cause friction with Vivienne. I thought about how he'd looked away when Sloane humiliated me, unable to meet my eyes. Was it possible that Nathaniel didn't know what was happening? Could Vivienne be managing the finances without his full awareness of where the money was actually going? My phone rang, startling me so badly I nearly dropped it. The caller ID showed Nathaniel's name, and for a moment I considered not answering. But he was still my son, and despite everything that had happened, I needed to hear his voice. "Hello, sweetheart," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Mom." He sounded tired, stressed. I wanted to call and, well, about what happened today at brunch. Hope flickered in my chest. Maybe he was calling to apologize, to acknowledge how inappropriate Sloane's behavior had been, to assure me that he would address it with his daughter. "I appreciate you calling," I said carefully. "Look, I know it was awkward, but Mom, you have to understand the position Vivienne and I are in. The Worthingtons are extremely important connections. Gerald has direct influence over several potential clients for my firm. We can't afford to have anything disrupt those relationships." The hope in my chest died. He wasn't calling to apologize. He was calling to justify what had happened. "Nathaniel," I said slowly, "your daughter publicly humiliated me. She snatched food out of my hands and made comments about my weight in front of strangers. Your wife supported her behavior. And you sat there and said nothing." There was a long pause. "Mom, don't you think you're being a bit dramatic? Sloane was concerned about your health. Maybe she didn't express it in the best way, but she meant well." "She meant well?" I couldn't keep the disbelief out of my voice. "Nathaniel, she treated me like a child who couldn't be trusted to feed herself." "You are getting older, Mom. Maybe she has a point. Have you talked to your doctor about your weight? About dietary restrictions?" I felt like I'd been slapped. My own son was now criticizing my weight, justifying his daughter's cruelty as health concern. "My health is fine," I said quietly. "And that's not what this is about. This is about respect, Nathaniel. Basic human dignity. I don't want to argue about this." His voice had taken on an edge. "I'm calling because Vivienne is upset. She feels like you were judging her hosting abilities, like you weren't being supportive." "I spent 6 hours preparing that brunch," I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "I cooked everything. I cleaned. I did exactly what she asked me to do. But you did it with an attitude, Mom. Vivienne could tell you weren't happy about helping. That made everyone uncomfortable, including the Worthingtons." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The narrative was being completely rewritten. I was now the problem, the difficult one, the person who had ruined the brunch with my bad attitude. "Nathaniel," I said, and I heard my voice crack slightly, "I'm your mother." "I know that, Mom. But you have to understand that Vivienne is my wife. She's the mother of my child. My primary loyalty has to be to her." The words hit me like a physical blow. Primary loyalty. As if love was a competition, as if caring about his mother somehow diminished his relationship with his wife. "I see," I said quietly. "So where does that leave me? What am I to you if not family worthy of basic respect?" Another long pause. "You're being dramatic again. No one said you're not family. We just need you to be more flexible. More understanding of what Vivienne needs." I thought about what I'd discovered in his financial accounts. The massive transfers, the depleted savings, the inadequate retirement fund. Should I tell him? Should I mention that I'd been looking at his accounts? But something stopped me. Some instinct that said if I revealed what I knew right now, over the phone while he was defensive and dismissive, it would backfire. He would accuse me of snooping, of invading his privacy. Vivienne would find a way to explain everything away or blame me for causing problems. Nathaniel, I said slowly, when was the last time you really looked at your financial accounts? Your savings, your investments? The question seemed to catch him off guard. What? Why are you asking about that? Just curious. You work so hard. I hope you're being smart about building for the future. Vivienne handles most of the day-to-day financial management, he said, and I could hear some defensiveness creeping into his voice. She's very good with money. She's got everything under control. Has she shown you the account statements recently? The balances? Mom, what is this about? Why are you asking these questions? I took a deep breath. I just want to make sure you're protected, sweetheart. That's all a mother wants. I'm 45 years old. I think I can manage my own finances without my mother's supervision. His voice had gone cold. Is there anything else? Because I have work to do. No, I said quietly. Nothing else. Okay. Well, I hope you can think about what I said. About being more supportive. Vivienne really does appreciate your help, but we need you to have a better attitude about it. He hung up without saying goodbye, without saying he loved me, without any of the warmth that used to characterize our relationship. I sat there holding my phone, staring at the notes I'd taken about his financial accounts, and felt something harden inside my chest. My son had chosen to believe that I was the problem. He had dismissed my feelings, justified my humiliation, and refused to even consider that his wife and daughter might have behaved inappropriately. But more than that, he was clearly blind to what was happening with his money. Vivienne was systematically draining his accounts, and he either didn't know or didn't want to know. The question was, what was she doing with all that money? I spent the rest of Sunday evening doing something I never thought I'd do, investigating my own family. I started with social media, looking at Vivienne's public accounts. Her Instagram was a carefully curated showcase of luxury living. Photos of expensive dinners at exclusive restaurants. Pictures of designer handbags and shoes, always tagged with the brand names. Selfies from high-end spas and salons. Vacation photos from exotic locations. I scrolled back through her posts, looking at the dates, and my stomach sank as I cross-referenced them with the financial records I'd reviewed. That $3,400 restaurant bill? Posted about on Instagram 3 days later with the caption, celebrating life's little moments at Chez Marcel. The $1,200 boutique purchase? Showed up in a post showing off a new designer dress. The $800 spa day? Documented in a series of stories about essential self-care. But it was Sloane's accounts that really made my blood boil. She had multiple social media profiles, some public, some that I could only view because she'd never bothered to block her grandmother. On these accounts, she posted freely about her lifestyle without the curated perfection of her mother's feed. Photos of shopping trips with her friends, the bags from stores I recognized as wildly expensive. Posts about spontaneous weekend trips to beach resorts and mountain lodges. Videos of her getting into a brand new BMW convertible with the caption, Sweet 16 came a little early this year. Thanks Mom and Dad. A BMW convertible. For a 16-year-old. That car had to have cost at least $50,000, probably more with the options I could see in the photos. And Nathaniel had said nothing about it to me. When had Sloane gotten this car? How had they afforded it? Except I knew how they'd afforded it. The money had come from those transfers I'd seen, the funds being siphoned out of Nathaniel's accounts month after month. I kept digging. I found posts about expensive clothes, jewelry, concert tickets, dining at restaurants where entrees cost more than I spent on groceries for a week. And woven throughout it all were casual comments that made my hands shake with anger. On a photo of her and her friends at some exclusive club, when your parents understand that you deserve the best. On a video showing off new jewelry, sometimes being the favorite has its perks. On a picture from a luxury hotel, another weekend escape because Grandma was being annoying again and we needed a break. Grandma was being annoying. That was me. I was the annoyance that justified their luxury getaways. I spent hours going through these posts, documenting everything, taking screenshots, making notes of dates and amounts where I could connect social media posts to financial transactions. The picture that emerged was clear. Vivienne was using money from Nathaniel's accounts to fund an extravagant lifestyle for herself and Sloan, far beyond what even his substantial income should support. By Monday morning, I'd barely slept. My mind kept churning through everything I'd discovered, trying to make sense of it all. I made coffee and sat at my kitchen table, surrounded by the notes and screenshots I'd printed out, trying to decide what to do next. I couldn't go to Nathaniel. He'd made it clear that he trusted Vivienne completely and saw me as the problem. If I came to him with accusations about his wife stealing from him, he'd dismiss it as jealousy or interference. But I couldn't just sit on this information either. Something was very wrong in my son's household, and it went far deeper than simple disrespect or poor family dynamics. Then I remembered something. 2 years ago, when Nathaniel had been dealing with those estate planning issues, he'd worked with a financial advisor named Marcus Chin. I'd met Marcus once when Nathaniel had asked me to sit in on a meeting about some trust documents. Marcus had struck me as thorough, ethical, and genuinely concerned about his client's financial well-being. I still had Marcus's business card in my desk drawer, kept because I'd thought at the time that maybe I should consult with someone about my own modest retirement planning. I pulled out the card and stared at it for a long moment. This felt like a betrayal of Nathaniel, going behind his back to talk to his financial advisor. But what was the alternative? Watch silently while his wife drained his accounts? Stand by while his financial future was demolished? Before I could second-guess myself, I picked up my phone and dialed the number. Chin Financial Services, this is Marcus Chin speaking. Mr. Chin, this is Beatrice Holloway. I don't know if you remember me, but I'm Nathaniel Holloway's mother. We met a couple of years ago regarding some estate planning matters. Mrs. Holloway, of course I remember you. How can I help you today? I took a deep breath. I need to speak with you about something concerning Nathaniel's financial accounts. I've discovered some irregularities that worry me, and I'm not sure what to do about them. There was a pause. Mrs. Holloway, you understand that I'm bound by confidentiality regarding Nathaniel's financial information. I can't discuss his accounts without his permission. I understand that. But Mr. Chen, I have access to his accounts through the banking app. I can see the transactions. And what I'm seeing concerns me greatly. I'm not asking you to violate confidentiality. I'm asking if you can at least listen to what I've found and tell me if my concerns are valid. Another pause, longer this time. Mrs. Holloway, this is highly unusual. I know it is. But Mr. Chen, I think my son is being stolen from. I think his wife is systematically draining his accounts, and he doesn't know it's happening. I need someone who understands finances to tell me if what I'm seeing is as bad as I think it is. I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line, considering. Finally, he spoke. Can you come to my office? Today if possible. I can give you 30 minutes at 2 o'clock this afternoon. I'll be there. Thank you, Mr. Chin. I spent the rest of the morning organizing my documentation. I printed out detailed summaries of the transactions I'd tracked, the screenshots from social media showing Vivienne and Sloane's extravagant spending, the timeline I'd created connecting financial movements to specific purchases and events. By the time I arrived at Marcus Chen's office at 1:55 p.m., I had a folder 3 inches thick with evidence. Marcus's office was in a professional building downtown, tastefully decorated but not ostentatious. He greeted me warmly and ushered me into a conference room where we could spread out my documentation. Mrs. Holloway, he began, before we start, I need to be clear about the limitations here. I can listen to what you found, and I can give you general guidance, but I cannot access Nathaniel's accounts or discuss specific details of his financial planning with you without his authorization. I understand, I said. I'm just asking you to look at what I've found and tell me if I'm overreacting. I laid out my documentation on the conference table, the transaction summaries, the social media posts, the calculations showing how much money had been transferred and where it appeared to have gone. Marcus spent 20 minutes reviewing everything in silence. His expression grew increasingly grave as he worked through the papers. Finally, he sat back in his chair and removed his reading glasses. "Mrs. Holloway," he said carefully, "what you're showing me is consistent with a pattern of financial abuse and potentially theft. The amounts being moved, the frequency of the transfers, the depletion of long-term savings in favor of short-term spending, this is not healthy financial management." My heart sank even as part of me felt validated. So I'm not imagining things? No, you're not. Based on what you're showing me here, someone with access to these accounts is engaging in what we call financial exploitation. They're systematically removing assets that should be building for the future and converting them to immediate personal use. What should I do? I asked. Nathaniel won't listen to me. He trusts his wife completely. Marcus frowned. That's the difficult part. Legally, if Vivienne has legitimate access to these accounts, if she's a joint account holder or has power of attorney, then what she's doing may not technically be illegal, even if it's morally wrong and financially devastating. But he doesn't know, I protested. She's managing the finances, and he's not looking at the accounts. He thinks everything is fine. Then he needs to look, Marcus said firmly. Mrs. Holloway, I can't contact Nathaniel about this based on information you've brought me. That would be a serious breach of professional ethics. But you're his mother. You can encourage him to schedule a meeting with me to review his overall financial picture. If he came in for a consultation, I could legitimately pull up his accounts and show him what's happening. He won't come, I said flatly. He thinks I'm being dramatic and causing problems. If I suggest he meet with you, he'll see it as me interfering. Marcus drummed his fingers on the table, thinking. There might be another approach. Does Nathaniel receive regular statements on these accounts? I assume so, but I don't know if he actually looks at them. Vivienne handles all of that. Exactly. Which means she could be intercepting or hiding the statements. Mrs. Holloway, what I'm about to suggest is somewhat unorthodox, but given what you've shown me, I think it's warranted. You have legitimate access to these accounts through the banking app, correct? Yes, from 2 years ago when Nathaniel added me temporarily. Then you have every right to view and download statements. I would suggest you do exactly that. Download comprehensive statements for the past year showing all transactions. Print them out. Then find a way to make sure Nathaniel sees them. Not through you directly, that gives him an excuse to dismiss it as you causing drama. But somehow, those statements need to end up in front of him where he'll actually look at them. I thought about that. How would I do that? Marcus smiled slightly. That's where I can't help you. I'm a financial advisor, not a strategist for family interventions. But Mrs. Holloway, your son needs to see what's happening to his money. The longer this goes on, the worse the damage will be. At the rate you've documented here, his retirement accounts will be completely depleted within 2 years. His savings are already dangerously low. If he has any kind of financial emergency, a job loss, a health crisis, anything unexpected, he'll have nothing to fall back on. The weight of it settled on my shoulders. This was even worse than I'd thought. There's one more thing, Marcus said, his expression growing darker. Based on the pattern you've shown me, with large amounts going to accounts in Sloane's name. Mrs. Holloway, I hate to even suggest this, but you need to consider the possibility that this isn't just excessive spending. Those educational expense transfers to Sloane's trust account? Those amounts are far too large to be legitimate educational costs. What are you saying? I'm saying that it's possible, and I emphasize this is just a possibility, that Vivienne might be moving money into Sloane's accounts to hide it. To shelter it from Nathaniel's access. People who are planning to leave a marriage sometimes engage in this kind of behavior, systematically moving assets into accounts that will be harder to access or trace in a divorce. The room felt like it was spinning. You think Vivienne might be planning to leave Nathaniel? I don't know that, and I'm not accusing her of anything specific. I'm just telling you that the pattern you've documented is consistent with someone who is either extraordinarily financially irresponsible or someone who is deliberately draining accounts for a purpose. Either way, it's devastating to Nathaniel's financial future. I left Marcus Chen's office feeling like I'd aged 10 years in a single meeting. Everything was worse than I'd imagined. Not only was Vivienne stealing from Nathaniel, but she might be systematically preparing to destroy his life. And I was supposed to figure out how to make him see it when he'd already decided I was the problem, when he'd already chosen his wife's version of reality over his own mother's concerns. I drove back to my apartment in a daze, Marcus's words echoing in my mind. I needed to get those bank statements in front of Nathaniel. But how? As I pulled into my parking space, my phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Sloan. Grandma, Mom says you need to apologize for making everyone uncomfortable at brunch yesterday. She says you can't come over anymore until you learn to behave better. Also, you're not invited to my birthday party next month. You'd probably just embarrass us in front of my friends anyway. I stared at that message for a long moment. My 16-year-old granddaughter was telling me I wasn't welcome at her birthday party because I'd been embarrassing. The same granddaughter who'd snatched food from my hands and publicly body-shamed me. And she expected an apology. That's when it crystallized for me. This wasn't just about protecting Nathaniel from financial exploitation. This was about my own dignity. About refusing to accept being treated as less than human by people who should love me. I thought about Vivienne's lie at the brunch, telling the Worthingtons I was managing the family finances. At the time, I'd been confused about why she'd say that. Now, with everything Marcus had told me, I understood. She was setting up a narrative. If money went missing, if questions were asked, she could point to me. The confused old woman who had access to the accounts. The perfect scapegoat. She was planning something. And part of that plan involved positioning me as someone who couldn't be trusted, who was mentally declining, who might make mistakes with financial matters. That's why she'd been systematically humiliating me, making me small in my son's eyes, in front of witnesses like the Worthingtons. She was building a case, creating a story where I was the unreliable one. I sat in my car in that parking lot and made a decision. I wasn't going to confront Vivienne directly. I wasn't going to beg Nathaniel to believe me. I was going to be strategic. I was going to gather every piece of evidence I could find, document everything thoroughly, and then I was going to expose exactly what was happening in a way that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. Vivienne thought she was so clever, stealing from her husband while making his mother look like the crazy one. But she'd made one crucial mistake. She'd left me access to the accounts. She thought I was too old, too confused, too irrelevant to notice what was happening. She was about to learn just how wrong she was. The week following my meeting with Marcus Chin passed in a blur of obsessive documentation. I barely slept, barely ate, my entire world narrowing to spreadsheets and bank statements and social media screenshots. My small apartment had transformed into something that looked like a detective's war room, papers spread across every surface, sticky notes color-coded by category, red for suspicious transfers, yellow for luxury purchases, blue for discrepancies in Vivienne's stories. I downloaded 5 years' worth of bank statements from Nathaniel's accounts, and the pattern was even more disturbing when viewed over that extended timeline. The financial exploitation hadn't started suddenly. It had been gradual, insidious, like a cancer slowly consuming healthy tissue. In the early years of their marriage, Vivienne's spending had been reasonable, even modest. But 3 years ago, something had shifted. The transfers had begun small, an extra 1,000 here, 2,000 there. Then they'd grown larger and more frequent. Over the past 3 years, I calculated that Vivienne had moved more than $340,000 from Nathaniel's accounts into her personal account and Sloan's trust fund. $340,000. The number made me physically ill. But it was what I discovered on Wednesday evening that transformed my investigation from concern to absolute certainty that something criminal was happening. I'd been reviewing older statements when I noticed something peculiar. 18 months ago, there had been a massive deposit into Nathaniel's account, $85,000. The memo line read, Inheritance, G. Holloway Estate. My breath caught. G. Holloway. That was Gerald Holloway, Nathaniel's uncle on his father's side. I vaguely remembered Nathaniel mentioning that Uncle Gerald had passed away and had left him something in his will, but Nathaniel had been oddly brief about it, saying only that it wasn't much and that Vivienne was handling the details. $85,000 was not much. That was a substantial inheritance. I traced what had happened to that money, and my hands began to shake as I documented the trail. Within 2 weeks of the inheritance deposit, the entire amount had been transferred out of Nathaniel's account. $30,000 had gone to Vivienne's personal account. $40,000 had been moved to Sloane's trust fund. The remaining $15,000 had been withdrawn in cash over the course of several days. The inheritance Nathaniel believed was insignificant had actually been $85,000, and Vivienne had made sure none of it stayed in his accounts. She'd moved it immediately, systematically, ensuring it became her money and Sloane's money rather than part of their family's financial foundation. This wasn't just excessive spending anymore. This was deliberate theft. This was fraud. I spent Thursday following another thread that had been nagging at me. If Vivienne was this comfortable stealing from Nathaniel, what else might she be hiding? I started looking at property records, business registrations, anything that might reveal other financial activities. What I found made my blood run cold. 6 months ago, Vivienne had registered a business, Lux Lifestyle Consulting LLC. According to the public records, she was listed as the sole owner and operator. The business address was a P.O. box in the next town over. I'd never heard Nathaniel mention that Vivienne had started a business. But more troubling was what I discovered when I cross-referenced the business registration with bank records. There had been multiple transfers from Nathaniel's account to an account labeled LLC operating account over the past 6 months, totaling $47,000. The memo lines all read, Business Startup Costs, V. Holloway. Nathaniel had funded his wife's business with $47,000, and I was willing to bet he had no idea that's what the money had been used for. Vivienne had probably told him it was for household expenses, or investments, or any of 100 lies that he'd accepted without question. But what was this Lux Lifestyle Consulting business actually doing? I spent hours searching for any online presence, a website, social media accounts, business listings. Nothing. The company existed on paper, had a bank account receiving substantial funds, but had no apparent business operations. It was a shell. A way to move money out of Nathaniel's reach under the guise of legitimate business expenses. By Friday morning, I knew I had enough evidence to prove systematic financial fraud. But I still hadn't figured out how to get Nathaniel to actually look at it, to see what was happening right under his nose. That's when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. Mrs. Holloway? This is Janet Pritchard. I'm a paralegal at Whitfield and Associates, the law firm where your son works. My heart started pounding. Yes? Is something wrong? Is Nathaniel all right? Oh, he's fine, physically. But Mrs. Holloway, I'm calling because I'm concerned about something, and I'm not sure what to do about it. I probably shouldn't be making this call at all, but, well, I've known Nathaniel for 8 years, and something isn't right. What do you mean? I could hear her take a deep breath. About 3 weeks ago, Nathaniel came to me and asked me to help him understand some financial documents. He seemed confused, worried. He said some money was missing from his accounts and he couldn't figure out where it had gone. I helped him review some bank statements, and Mrs. Holloway, there were some very concerning transactions. My pulse was racing now. He knows. He's noticed the missing money. He noticed some of it. But then his wife came to the office, and they had a private conversation in the conference room. After that, Nathaniel told me he'd been mistaken, that everything was fine, that his wife had explained everything. But Mrs. Holloway, he looked defeated. Scared, even. And yesterday, I overheard his wife on the phone in the lobby. She was talking to someone about keeping the old woman confused and making sure the documentation stays buried. The old woman. That was me. Vivienne had been talking about me. Did you hear anything else? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She said something about how the mother is already on the accounts, so if anything comes up, we have our explanation. Mrs. Holloway, I think she might be setting you up for something. And I think your son might know more than he's letting on, but he's too frightened to act. After I hung up with Janet, I sat in stunned silence. Nathaniel knew. He discovered that money was missing, had started investigating, and then Vivienne had somehow convinced him to drop it. How? What kind of hold did she have over him? And the reference to keeping me confused, to using my access to the accounts as an explanation, that confirmed what Marcus Chen and I had suspected. I was being positioned as the scapegoat. If Vivienne's theft was ever discovered, she planned to blame me. The confused elderly mother with account access who must have made mistakes or, worse, deliberately stolen from her own son. It was brilliant, in a sociopathic way. Who would Nathaniel believe, his wife, or his mother whom his wife had been systematically portraying as mentally declining and causing problems? But now I understood something else. Nathaniel's silence at the brunch, his refusal to defend me, his insistence that I needed to be more supportive, it wasn't just about social climbing. He was terrified. Vivienne had some kind of leverage over him, something that kept him compliant even when he knew something was wrong. I needed to understand what that leverage was. And I needed to do it quickly. That evening, I did something that would have seemed unthinkable to me a week ago. I drove to Nathaniel's house in Oakmont Hills and parked 3 houses down, where I could see their driveway but wasn't obviously loitering. I felt ridiculous, like some kind of amateur spy, but I needed information. I'd been sitting there for about 40 minutes when Vivienne's Mercedes pulled out of the driveway. I waited until she'd turned the corner, then I called Nathaniel's cell phone. He answered on the 3rd ring. "Mom? Is everything okay? I need to talk to you," I said. "Are you home? Can I come over?" There was a pause. "Vivienne's not here right now." "I know. That's why I'm calling." "Nathaniel, I need 10 minutes of your time. Just 10 minutes, and then I'll leave. Please." Another long pause. "Okay. Come over." He met me at the door, and I was shocked by how he looked. In just a week since the brunch, he seemed to have aged years. There were dark circles under his eyes, his hair was disheveled, and he was wearing sweatpants and a wrinkled t-shirt in the middle of the afternoon, something the always impeccably dressed Nathaniel would never normally do. "You look terrible," I said before I could stop myself. He gave me a weak smile. "Thanks, Mom. Always know how to make a guy feel good about himself." "What's wrong, sweetheart? And please, don't tell me nothing. I can see that something is very wrong." "No." The word came out more forcefully than I intended. "No, I'm not leaving. In fact, I think it's time Vivienne and I had a conversation." "Mom, please, you don't know what she's capable of." "Yes, I do. I know exactly what she's capable of. But she doesn't know what I'm capable of." I pulled out my phone and opened the banking app. "Nathaniel, I want you to go upstairs. I want you to be within earshot, but I don't want you visible. Can you do that?" He looked terrified but nodded. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to feed her a surprise. Just like that plate she snatched from my hands." I smiled, and it felt cold and sharp. It's time Vivienne Holloway learned that this grandmother isn't as helpless as she thinks. 15 minutes later, I heard the front door open. Vivienne's voice rang out, bright and false. "Gerald, Priscilla, please come in. Nathaniel should be around here somewhere. Make yourselves comfortable in the living room." I stayed in the kitchen, calmly arranging the documents I'd brought with me on the counter. My heart was pounding, but my hands were steady. Vivienne appeared in the doorway and froze when she saw me. "Beatrice. What are you doing here?" "Hello, Vivienne. I came to have a conversation with my son. But since you're here with guests, perhaps we should all talk together." Her eyes narrowed. "I think you should leave. We're about to have an important discussion, and your presence isn't appropriate." "On the contrary. I think my presence is extremely appropriate." I picked up one of the bank statements. "Especially since you've been telling people that I'm managing Nathaniel's financial accounts." The color drained from her face. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Really?" Because I have witnesses who heard you tell Gerald and Priscilla Worthington that I'm on all of Nathaniel's accounts, that I help manage his finances. That was quite a specific lie, Vivienne. Why would you say that? She glanced toward the living room, where I could hear the Worthingtons settling in, then back at me. Her expression transformed from shock to cold fury. Get out of my house. It's not your house. It's Nathaniel's house, bought with Nathaniel's money. Or rather, it was bought with Nathaniel's money. Before you started stealing it. I spread the documents across the counter. $340,000, Vivienne. That's how much you've taken from my son's accounts over the past 3 years. Did you really think no one would notice? You're delusional. Those accounts are joint accounts. I have every right to access that money. Joint accounts, yes. But that doesn't give you the right to commit fraud. Creating fake businesses to funnel money away. Stealing Nathaniel's inheritance and pretending it was insignificant. Moving enormous sums into Sloane's trust fund under false pretenses. I picked up another document. And then there's the blackmail. The documents from 3 years ago that you're using to keep my son terrified and compliant. Her face had gone white, then red, then white again. You can't prove any of that. Actually, I can. I have 5 years of bank statements. I have business registration records. I have social media evidence showing expenditures that match suspicious transactions. I have testimony from Nathaniel's colleague about your threatening behavior. I smiled at her. And most importantly, I have recordings of our conversation right now, where you haven't denied a single accusation. That was a bluff. I wasn't recording anything. But Vivienne didn't know that, and I saw panic flash across her face. What do you want? She asked, her voice low and dangerous. I want you to walk into that living room and tell Gerald and Priscilla Worthington the truth. I want you to admit that you lied about my involvement in the finances. And then I want you to sit down with Nathaniel and me and a lawyer and work out exactly how you're going to return the money you've stolen. And if I don't? Then I take all of this evidence to the police and to the partners at Nathaniel's firm. And I make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of person you are. I leaned forward. You wanted to use me as your scapegoat, Vivienne. You wanted to make me look confused and incompetent so you could blame your theft on the helpless old woman. But you made one critical mistake. What's that? You underestimated me. You thought because I let you humiliate me, because I sat quietly in the breakfast nook while you took credit for my cooking, because I didn't fight back when your daughter snatched food from my hands, you thought that meant I was weak. I smiled. But I wasn't being weak. I was being patient. I was watching. I was learning. And now I know everything. Vivienne's hands were shaking. Nathaniel will never believe you. He trusts me. Nathaniel already knows. He's known for weeks that money was missing. You thought you'd intimidated him into silence with your blackmail, but you just made him desperate enough to finally listen to his mother. I called out toward the stairs. Isn't that right, Nathaniel? My son appeared at the top of the stairs, and the look he gave Vivienne was one of pure betrayal and grief. She's right, Vivienne. About all of it. I know what you've been doing. I know about the money. I know about the shell company. I know about Uncle Gerald's inheritance. He came down the stairs slowly. And I know that the documents you've been holding over my head? Rebecca Martinez says they'd be inadmissible in any ethics hearing because of the statute of limitations and because I self-reported the error immediately. You've been blackmailing me with something that couldn't actually hurt me. Vivienne looked between us, trapped. For a moment, I thought she might try to run. Then her expression hardened into something cruel and calculating. Fine. You want to play it this way? Go ahead. Tell the Worthingtons whatever you want. Expose me. But Beatrice, you'll destroy your relationship with your granddaughter in the process. Sloane will never forgive you for attacking her mother. Sloane, I said quietly, has already made it clear that she doesn't want me in her life. She uninvited me from her birthday party because I embarrassed her. She posts on social media about how annoying I am. She snatched food from my hands and publicly body shamed me. Whatever relationship you think I'm protecting with her, Vivienne, it's already gone. You destroyed it when you taught her that treating people with cruelty was acceptable. Mom's right, Nathaniel said, his voice stronger now. This ends today, Vivienne. You're going to walk in there and tell the Worthingtons that you were mistaken about Mom managing our finances. Then you're going to pack a bag and move into the guest house while we sort out how this marriage is going to end. You're divorcing me? She looked genuinely shocked. Did you think I'd just keep living like this? Being stolen from? Being blackmailed in my own home? Watching you poison my daughter against her own grandmother? Nathaniel's voice cracked. I loved you, Vivienne. I would have given you anything you asked for. But you didn't ask. You just took. And you made me complicit in your cruelty. For a moment, Vivienne just stood there, her perfect facade finally cracking. Then she turned and walked into the living room, where I could hear her making excuses to the Worthingtons about a family emergency. They left quickly, and the house fell silent. Nathaniel and I stood in the kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of his wife's betrayal, and he started to cry. I held my son while he sobbed, grieving for the marriage he thought he had, for the life he believed was real. I'm so sorry, Mom, he said between sobs. I'm sorry I didn't defend you. I'm sorry I let her treat you that way. I'm sorry I chose fear over family. Shoo, I said, stroking his hair like I had when he was a little boy. You were scared. You were manipulated. But you're free now. We both are. 3 months later, I sat in a courtroom watching Vivienne sign divorce papers. She'd agreed to return most of the stolen money, though much of it was already spent, and to give up any claim to Nathaniel's future earnings. In exchange, Nathaniel agreed not to press criminal charges for the fraud and theft. Sloane had chosen to live with her mother, and that hurt more than I'd expected. But Nathaniel had started therapy and was slowly rebuilding his sense of self-worth. He called me every day, often multiple times, just to talk. The Worthingtons, interestingly enough, had become unlikely allies. When Priscilla heard the full story, she'd contacted me to apologize for her role in the humiliation at the brunch. She'd also mentioned that her own sister had been victimized by similar financial abuse, and she respected how I'd handled the situation. As for me, I'd discovered something important through all of this. I'd spent so many years making myself small, trying to accommodate everyone else's needs, accepting disrespect because I thought that's what family required. But I'd learned that real family doesn't require you to diminish yourself. Real love doesn't demand that you accept cruelty in silence. The plate that Sloane snatched from my hands that Sunday morning had seemed like the worst moment of my life. But it had actually been a gift. It had woken me up. It had shown me that I deserved better. And it had given me the courage to fight for my son and for myself. Sometimes the surprise you feed someone isn't revenge. Sometimes it's truth. Sometimes it's just refusing to be what they expect you to be, small, confused, helpless. Sometimes the surprise is simply standing up and saying, I see you. I know what you're doing. And it ends now. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below with your thoughts. And if this story resonated with you, please share it. You never know who might need to hear that they deserve better than the treatment they're accepting. Thank you for staying with me until the end. You matter. Your dignity matters. And you are never too old to stand up for yourself. Thank you for following Beatrice's journey from humiliation to empowerment. Remember, respect isn't something you can demand, but it is something you can require. Never let anyone make you feel small, especially not the people who should love you most.